Hey guys, tonight we're diving into ancient Babylon, but not the sanitized version you learned in school. Picture this. You're standing on the banks of the muddy Euphrates River, watching a terrified woman being dragged toward the water by temple guards. She's accused of adultery, but here's the twist. Her guilt won't be decided by judges or evidence. The river itself will determine her fate. Welcome to Babylonian justice, where gods made the final call and you probably won't survive the process. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our global community come together for these late-night historical deep dives. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're witnessing what historians call the river ordeal, one of the most bizarre forms of justice ever devised by human civilization. The woman's hands are bound behind her back, and you watch as priests mutter incantations to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. The theory was elegantly simple and absolutely terrifying. If she's innocent, the river will protect her and carry her safely to shore. If she's guilty, she'll drown. Divine justice served with a side of hypothermia. But here's where it gets really weird. Sometimes the accuser had to jump in too. You read that right. If you pointed the finger at someone for a serious crime like witchcraft or theft, you might find yourself taking an involuntary swimming lesson alongside your target. The survivor was declared innocent, while the drowned party was posthumously convicted. It was like a deadly game of trust fall, except nobody was there to catch you except possibly a very moody river god. The Euphrates wasn't just any river to the Babylonians. It was a living entity, a divine judge that could peer into human souls and separate truth from lies. You can almost hear the splash as bodies hit the water, the desperate gasps for air, the crowds gathering on the banks to witness what they believed was divine judgment in action. Modern forensic science would have saved a lot of lives, but apparently the Babylonians preferred their justice with a healthy dose of drowning. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were actually carried out as frequently as the legal codes suggest, or if they were more of a deterrent, the ancient equivalent of "we have ways of making you talk." Some scholars point to the practical problems. What if both parties drowned? What if someone was an excellent swimmer? Did they factor in seasonal water levels? The Code of Hammurabi mentions these trials, but the details are frustratingly vague, like a recipe missing half the ingredients. What makes this even more unsettling is that river ordeals weren't unique to Babylon. You'll find similar practices scattered across ancient civilizations from Egypt to medieval Europe, suggesting that humans have always had a peculiar relationship with water as a truth detector. But the Babylonians perfected the art, turning what might have been a simple dunking into an elaborate religious ceremony complete with prayers, witnesses, and probably some very nervous defendants. The procedure had rules, of course. This was Babylon, after all, a civilization that invented some of the world's first legal codes. The accused had the right to choose trial by ordeal instead of accepting a judge's verdict, which sounds generous until you realize you're essentially choosing between certain punishment and possible drowning. The water temperature, the binding of hands, even the time of day, everything was regulated by priestly authorities who took their role as divine interpreters very seriously. You might wonder what happened to those who survived. Interestingly, they didn't just walk away free. They often had to compensate their accusers for the trouble of organizing a near-drowning experience. It was like paying legal fees, except your lawyer was a river and your courthouse was wherever the current felt strongest. The system had a twisted logic. If you survived, The gods clearly favored you, so you must be prosperous enough to afford compensation. The psychological impact on Babylonian society must have been profound. Imagine living in a world where your innocence could only be proven by your ability to not drown while bound and thrown into a river. Every dispute, every accusation, carried the potential for this ultimate test. You'd probably think twice before making enemies, knowing that any serious conflict could end with both of you testing the river's mercy. It was the ancient world's most extreme form of alternative dispute resolution. The river ordeals were just the beginning of Babylon's creative approach to justice. You're about to encounter something that would make modern lawyers weep. Hammurabi's Code, carved in stone around 1750 BCE and containing some of the most literally minded punishments in human history. This wasn't just an eye for an eye. This was justice with a mechanical precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker proud and a crime victim absolutely terrified. Picture yourself as a Babylonian surgeon whose patient died during an operation. Under Hammurabi's Code, you wouldn't just lose your medical license, you'd lose your hands. Literally. The code specified that if a surgeon caused the death of a free man during surgery, his hands would be cut off, ensuring he'd never operate again. It's the ultimate malpractice insurance, paid in flesh rather than gold. You can almost hear the wet thud of the axe falling, the surgeon's screams echoing through the marketplace where these punishments were carried out as public spectacles. But the code's symmetry goes beyond simple body part mathematics. If you knocked out someone's tooth in a fight, your tooth would be knocked out in return, but only if your victim was of equal social status. This is where Babylonian justice gets deliciously complicated and deeply unfair. If a free man knocked out a slave's tooth, he'd pay a fine equivalent to half the slave's value. If a slave knocked out a free man's tooth, well, let's just say that slave wouldn't be chewing solid food for a very long time, if at all. The code recognized three distinct social classes: free men, commoners, and slaves. Your punishment depended entirely on which rung of society you occupied and which rung your victim claimed. A free man who killed another free man's slave would replace that slave with one of equal value, human life reduced to a commodity exchange. But if that same slave killed a free man's son, the slave's own son would be executed. Justice wasn't blind in Babylon. It was extremely class-conscious and had perfect vision when it came to social hierarchies. Historians still argue whether Hammurabi's Code was actually enforced with the brutal consistency it suggests, or if it served more as a deterrent and negotiating starting point. Archaeological evidence shows that many disputes were settled through compensation rather than mutilation, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, not every petty theft resulted in a hand being chopped off. But the code's existence proves that these punishments were at least theoretically possible, which must have made every Babylonian think twice before starting trouble. The sexual politics of the code reveal a society obsessed with property rights, including property rights over women's bodies. If you were a married woman caught in adultery, you and your lover would be bound together and thrown into the river, unless your husband decided to forgive you, in which case the king might spare your lover too. It was like a twisted version of marriage counseling, where the therapist was a river and the couple's session might end in drowning. The code treated women's sexuality as property that could be damaged, stolen, or protected through violence. But here's where it gets really weird. The code also protected women in some unexpected ways. If a man falsely accused his neighbor's wife of adultery, he'd be marked with a hot iron and have half his hair shaved off, the ancient equivalent of a scarlet letter, except more painful and impossible to hide under a hat. You'd walk through Babylon streets as a living warning about the dangers of bearing false witness, your scalp telling the story of your failed accusation to anyone who cared to look. The code's approach to theft was particularly creative. Steal a sheep or an ox, and you'd pay back 10 times its value. Steal from a temple or palace, and you'd die. But steal from a burning house during a fire, and you'd be thrown into that same fire. Poetic justice with a side of actual combustion. It's like the universe's way of saying, you wanted to profit from disaster. Here, have some disaster of your own. The punishment literally matched the crime setting, creating a kind of thematic consistency that modern justice systems completely lack. Property damage followed similar logic. If you flooded your neighbor's field through negligent irrigation, you'd compensate them for lost crops. But if you stole water from someone else's irrigation system, you'd be sold into slavery. Water theft was apparently serious business in a desert civilization, which makes perfect sense when you consider that Babylon's entire agricultural system depended on careful water management. Every drop mattered, and stealing it was tantamount to stealing someone's livelihood. The code even regulated family relationships with mathematical precision. If you struck your father, your hands would be cut off. No exceptions, no appeals, no second chances. Parent-child relationships weren't just sacred. They were protected by the threat of permanent disability. It's the ultimate respect your elders enforcement mechanism, guaranteed to make family dinners much more polite and considerably less violent. From the river's judgment and the code's symmetry, you now enter an even more disturbing aspect of Babylonian punishment, the systematic marking of human property. You're standing in a marketplace where the acrid smell of burning flesh mingles with incense and spices, watching as red-hot bronze brand sear permanent marks into living skin. This wasn't just punishment. This was conversion, the legal transformation of a human being into livestock. Babylonian law recognized slavery as both punishment and economic necessity, but what made their system particularly brutal was its permanence. Unlike some ancient civilizations where slaves could earn or buy their freedom, Babylonian slave brands were forever. The hot iron burned deep enough to scar over any attempts at removal, creating a permanent record of legal status that couldn't be hidden, forged, or forgotten. You can imagine the sizzling sound as metal meets flesh. The victim's screams mixing with the crowd's casual chatter, as if they were watching a blacksmith shoe a horse rather than brand a human being. The branding process followed specific legal protocols that would make modern bureaucrats proud and human rights activists nauseous. Different crimes called for different brand locations and designs. Thieves received marks on their foreheads, clearly visible to anyone they might try to rob in the future. Runaway slaves got brands on their cheeks, marking them as flight risks who required extra supervision. Each brand told a story, transforming human faces into legal documents that could be read by anyone literate in the language of seared flesh. But here's where Babylonian efficiency meets casual cruelty. They developed a sophisticated grading system for their human property. Fresh slaves, whether captured in war, sold for debt, or convicted of crimes, received basic brands indicating their legal status. But slaves who proved troublesome got additional marks, creating a kind of permanent criminal record written in scar tissue. You'd carry your entire legal history on your skin, unable to escape your past because it was literally burned into your body. The psychology behind slave branding reveals a civilization that understood the power of permanent marking better than most modern governments understand identity documentation. A branded slave couldn't disappear into another city and claim free status. Their face or hand immediately identified them as property to anyone who looked. It was the ancient world's most effective form of identification system, more reliable than any document because it couldn't be lost, stolen, or counterfeited. Historians still argue whether branding was primarily about identification or humiliation, but the evidence suggests it served both purposes with devastating effectiveness. Branded slaves reported feelings of dehumanization that went beyond their legal status. The physical markings seemed to transform their self-perception, making them internalize their property status in ways that psychological conditioning alone couldn't achieve. The brand didn't just mark the body, it marked the soul. The technical aspects of Babylonian branding were surprisingly sophisticated. Different metals produced different colors and healing patterns. Bronze brands created reddish scars that stood out dramatically against skin. Iron brands produced darker marks that were equally permanent but less conspicuous. The choice of metal often reflected the slave's intended use. How slaves might receive more subtle markings, while field workers got brands designed for maximum visibility and deterrent effect. Religious authorities played a crucial role in the branding process, blessing the irons and invoking divine approval for the transformation of free persons into property. It wasn't enough to simply mark someone as a slave. The gods had to sanction this fundamental change in human status. Temple priests would chant prayers as the brands heated, treating the ceremony like a religious ritual that deserved divine attention and approval. The economic implications of slave branding created perverse incentives throughout Babylonian society. Slave traders developed expertise in assessing the quality and authenticity of brands, like art experts examining paintings for signs of forgery. Fresh brands indicated newly enslaved persons who might still retain valuable skills from their free lives. Old, well-heeled brands suggested experienced slaves who understood their place in the social hierarchy and were less likely to cause trouble. Master craftsmen sometimes branded their slaves with personal marks that indicated specialized training. A slave bearing a potter's brand was assumed to have ceramic skills, making them more valuable in trade. It was like a primitive form of professional certification, except the certificate was burned into human flesh and could never be revoked, updated, or transferred. Your skills became part of your scarred identity, increasing your market value, but also your owner's control over your future. The healing process itself became part of the punishment's psychological impact. Slaves had to care for their fresh brands while adjusting to their new legal status, spending weeks watching their wounds slowly transform into permanent scars. The daily reminder of their transformation from free person to property was built into the healing timeline, ensuring that the psychological impact lasted long after the physical pain subsided. Some slaves attempted to modify or conceal their brands through self-mutilation, creating additional scars that might obscure the original marking. But Babylonian law anticipated this, making the marketplace brands were disturbing enough. But you're about to discover a punishment that transformed the sacred into the profane in ways that would shock even the most jaded Babylonian observer. You're walking through the temple district, past elaborately decorated shrines dedicated to Ishtar, goddess of love and war, when you notice something that doesn't quite fit the religious atmosphere. Women who clearly don't want to be there, serving in capacities that blur the line between sacred ritual and criminal sentence. Welcome to temple prostitution as judicial punishment, a practice that turned religious service into a form of sexual slavery disguised as divine justice. When Babylonian courts sentenced certain female criminals to temple service, they weren't just assigning community service hours. They were condemning women to lives of ritualized sexual exploitation under the protection of religious law. The temples provided legal cover for what was essentially a sophisticated system of state-sanctioned sexual trafficking. The crimes that led to temple sentences weren't random. Adultery, theft from religious institutions, and violations of marriage contracts could all result in forced temple service. But here's the twisted logic. Since these crimes were seen as offenses against divine order, the punishment had to involve serving the gods in whatever capacity they required. And apparently, the gods required quite a lot of sexual service from convicted criminals, at least according to the priests who administered these sentences. Ishtar's temples were particularly notorious for this practice. As goddess of both love and war, Ishtar supposedly demanded sexual offerings from her devotees, creating a religious framework that justified forcing criminal women into prostitution. You can imagine the horror of being sentenced to serve a goddess who demanded your body as payment for your crimes, knowing that resistance would bring additional punishment for defying divine will. The economic aspects of this system reveal its true nature as institutionalized exploitation dressed up in religious clothing. Temple prostitutes generated significant revenue for religious institutions, with their earnings going directly to the priests who managed their services. It was a perfect crime. Sexual exploitation that was not only legal but religiously mandated, with built-in protection against criticism, because questioning the practice meant questioning the gods themselves. Historians still argue whether temple prostitution was primarily religious ritual or economic exploitation, but the evidence suggests it served both purposes with devastating efficiency. Archaeological records show that some temples accumulated substantial wealth through prostitution services, indicating that the practice was more about profit than piety. The religious justification provided legal cover for what was essentially a criminal enterprise operated by respected religious authorities. The women sentenced to temple service faced a unique form of psychological torture. Unlike regular slaves who could at least understand their status as property, temple prostitutes were told they were serving the gods, that their sexual exploitation was actually sacred service that brought them closer to divine grace. It was gaslighting on a theological level, using religious authority to convince victims that their abuse was actually a privilege. The process of temple assignment followed formal legal procedures that made the whole system appear legitimate. Courts would specify the duration of service, the particular temple, and sometimes even the specific types of services required. It was bureaucratic sexual trafficking, complete with paperwork, legal precedents, and administrative oversight. The systematic nature of the practice shows how thoroughly institutionalized sexual exploitation had become in Babylonian society. Different temples specialized in different types of services, creating a kind of market segmentation that would make modern business consultants proud and human rights activists horrified. Some temples catered to wealthy clients seeking elaborate rituals involving multiple women. Others served common soldiers and merchants with more basic services. The courts could tailor sentences to match both the crime and the criminal's social status, ensuring that even sexual exploitation maintained proper class distinctions. The duration of temple sentences varied dramatically based on the severity of the original crime. Minor offenses might result in a year of service, while serious crimes could lead to lifetime temple assignment. Some women entered the temples as young adults and never left, spending decades in religiously sanctioned sexual slavery that was impossible to escape because it was protected by both legal and divine authority. Religious festivals created particularly intense periods of exploitation, as temples competed to offer the most elaborate services to visiting pilgrims and dignitaries. During these events, sentenced women faced increased demands for their services, often working around the clock to accommodate the influx of religious tourists seeking divine favor through sexual rituals. The festivals that should have celebrated the gods instead became opportunities for intensified abuse of women trapped in the temple system. The psychological impact on families was devastating. Mothers, daughters, and wives disappeared into temples, often forbidden from contact with their former lives, to maintain the fiction that they were now dedicated to divine service. Families lost their female members to a system that made rescue impossible. How could you argue against the will of the gods? It was separation disguised as salvation, family destruction packaged as religious devotion. From the temple's sacred exploitation, you're about to witness punishment that abandoned all pretense of civilization and embraced pure terror as public policy. You're traveling along one of Nebuchadnezzar's magnificent royal highways, admiring the engineering marvel that connected Babylon to its far-flung territories, when you notice something that transforms this triumph of construction into a corridor of horror. Thousands of wooden stakes lining the road, each topped with a writhing, dying human being. This is impalement, Babylon's most theatrical form of execution, designed not just to kill, but to send a message that could be seen from miles away. The stakes weren't randomly placed. They were carefully positioned at regular intervals along major roads, creating what modern military strategists would recognize as psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Every traveler approaching Babylon would spend hours or even days walking past dying criminals, their screams serving as the city's most effective deterrent against crime and rebellion. The engineering behind mass impalement was disturbingly sophisticated. Babylonian executioners developed standardized stake lengths, positioning techniques, and even scheduling systems to ensure maximum visual impact. Stakes were driven at precise angles to keep victims alive as long as possible, while maintaining clear sight lines for approaching travelers. It was like urban planning designed by sadists, creating a landscape where death became part of the architectural experience. But here's where Babylonian efficiency meets medieval horror. They developed different impalement techniques for different crimes. Murderers were impaled through the torso, ensuring a relatively quick death that still provided hours of visible suffering. Traitors and rebels received stakes through the rectum, a slower, more agonizing death that could last for days, while the victim remained conscious and visible to passing traffic. The method of impalement told observers exactly what crime the victim had committed, turning each dying person into a living legal textbook. The logistics of mass impalement required substantial infrastructure and skilled personnel. Executioners trained specifically in stake placement, learning to position the wooden spears to avoid immediately fatal injuries, while ensuring the victim remained visible and audible to passing travelers. It was like a twisted form of medical training, teaching anatomy in service of prolonged death rather than healing. Specialized teams handled stake preparation, victim positioning, and ongoing maintenance of the display. Historians still argue whether the massive scale of roadside impalement was practical deterrent or royal propaganda. But contemporary accounts suggest that some highways featured thousands of dying criminals at once. The sheer logistics of feeding, guarding, and replacing these displays would have required significant resources, indicating that Babylonian rulers considered the psychological impact worth the substantial cost in personnel and materials. The psychological warfare aspects of highway impalement were carefully calculated. Approaching armies would spend days marching past graphic displays of what happened to those who opposed Babylonian authority. Trade caravans saw vivid reminders of the consequences of banditry or tax evasion. Even friendly diplomatic missions couldn't avoid the message that Babylon's justice was swift, visible, and extremely unpleasant for those who challenged royal authority. The timing of impalement was coordinated with travel seasons and military campaigns. Major displays coincided with periods of increased road traffic, ensuring maximum audience for the spectacle. During military campaigns, captured enemies were impaled along routes that opposing forces were likely to use, creating psychological pressure that could demoralize enemy troops before battles even began. It was strategic terror disguised as routine criminal justice. Different categories of stakes were used for different social classes, maintaining Babylonian social hierarchies even in death. Nobles received more elaborate stakes made from precious woods, while slaves and commoners got crude wooden spears. Even in their final moments, victims were reminded of their place in society's pecking order. Your social status determined not just how you lived, but how publicly and painfully you died. The maintenance crews who managed these displays developed their own professional culture and specialized knowledge. They knew which victims were likely to last longest, how weather affected decomposition rates, and when to replace stakes to maintain maximum visual impact. It was a job that required both strong stomachs and careful attention to detail, creating a whole profession dedicated to managing publicly displayed death. Seasonal considerations played a major role in impalement scheduling. Summer heat accelerated decomposition and intensified the smell, creating a more unpleasant experience for travelers but reducing the duration of the display. Winter cold preserved bodies longer, but made the stakes less visible from distance. Executioners had to balance multiple factors to achieve optimal deterrent effect, while managing practical concerns like public health and aesthetic impact. The sound design of mass impalement was as important as the visual impact. Thousands of dying victims created a continuous soundscape. The highway stakes were horrific enough, but you're about to discover how Babylonian punishment could transform architectural marvels into instruments of prolonged torture. You're being dragged in chains through the gates of Babylon, past the famous Ishtar Gate with its glazed blue bricks and golden lions, toward what appears to be paradise itself. The legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But this isn't a sightseeing tour. You're about to become part of the construction crew, and your sentence doesn't end until the day you die. Welcome to forced labor as architectural punishment, where criminals didn't just build monuments to Babylonian glory. They literally died building them, their bones becoming part of the foundation, and their blood mixing with the mortar. The Hanging Gardens weren't just an engineering marvel. They were a massive public works project powered by criminal labor, where your sentence was measured not in years, but in cubic yards of earth moved and terraces constructed. The shackles around your ankles aren't just restraints. They're designed to cut into your flesh with every step, ensuring that walking becomes a constant reminder of your status. The iron bands are sized to allow movement but prevent running, and the connecting chains are just long enough to let you work but short enough to tangle when you try to rest. It's ergonomic torture, carefully engineered to maximize productivity while maintaining constant discomfort. The work itself was backbreaking beyond modern comprehension. You're hauling massive stone blocks up ramps that seem to stretch toward the heavens, your shoulders already raw from the carrying yokes that distribute weight while digging into your flesh. The Hanging Gardens required millions of tons of earth, stone, and building materials, all transported by human muscle power fueled by fear, and supervised by guards who viewed worker death as a minor accounting problem rather than a human tragedy. But here's where Babylonian engineering meets criminal punishment. The garden's famous irrigation system was built by criminals who would never live to see it completed. You're digging channels and installing the complex network of pumps and waterways that would eventually create cascading waterfalls and lush terraces, knowing that your own bones might be ground up and mixed into the cement that holds the whole system together. It's the ultimate form of involuntary civic contribution. The quota system was diabolically efficient. Each work gang had daily targets for earth moved, stones hauled, or channels dug. Meet your quota, and you received a bowl of barley gruel and a place to sleep in the worker barracks. Fall short, and you worked through the night while your rations were cut in half. Exceed expectations, and you might earn an extra blanket or a slightly larger food portion. It was capitalism applied to slavery, with productivity bonuses measured in survival rather than salary. Historians still argue whether the hanging gardens actually existed or were merely legendary. But archaeological evidence suggests that massive construction projects in Babylon definitely used criminal labor on an industrial scale. Whether the specific gardens described by ancient writers were real or mythical, the punishment system that would have built them was absolutely genuine and thoroughly documented in surviving legal records. The specialized work assignments revealed a twisted form of career counseling based on criminal background. Former merchants were assigned to manage supply chains, ensuring that materials flowed efficiently to construction sites. Ex-soldiers supervised work gangs, using their leadership experience to maintain productivity through intimidation and violence. Even in slavery, your former life determined your current suffering. It was typecasting taken to criminal extremes. The medical care provided to worker slaves was purely economic rather than humanitarian. Injured workers who could still perform some tasks were patched up and returned to modified duties. Those too damaged to contribute were quietly disposed of, their bodies often incorporated into the construction project as fill material. It was healthcare with a cost-benefit analysis that considered human life purely in terms of construction productivity and material costs. Night shifts extended the workday beyond human endurance, with torches and oil lamps creating an eerie glow over the construction site that never stopped. You'd work in the blazing heat of the Mesopotamian sun, then continue under flickering artificial light while your body begged for rest. The 24-hour construction schedule meant that the sound of hammers, chisels, and dying workers never ceased. It was a symphony of suffering that played continuously until the project's completion. The accident rate was astronomical and completely ignored by supervisors focused on construction deadlines rather than worker safety. Cave-ins buried entire work gangs. Crane failures crushed multiple workers at once, and the primitive scaffolding systems collapsed regularly, sending dozens of criminals plummeting to their deaths. Each accident was recorded only in terms of productivity loss and replacement worker requirements, not human casualties. Weather conditions made the work even more brutal. Summer temperatures in Mesopotamia could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the construction site into an open-air oven where heat stroke was as common as hammer injuries. Winter brought freezing rain that made stone work treacherous and earth-moving nearly impossible. Workers died from exposure, heat exhaustion, and the simple inability of human bodies to endure such conditions while performing heavy labor. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical punishment. Work songs were forbidden. Silence made it easier to hear escape attempts and maintained the oppressive atmosphere. Communication between work gangs was prohibited. preventing the formation of relationships that might lead to cooperation or rebellion. You worked in isolation even while surrounded by hundreds of other suffering criminals, creating a loneliness that was almost as unbearable as the physical labor. Tool assignments reflected the administration's paranoia about rebellion and escape. Sharp implements were chained to workstations and counted obsessively by guards who feared that construction tools might become weapons. Hammers were attached to workers' wrists with leather cords, ensuring that dropping a tool meant dislocating your joint. Even in their exhaustion, criminals were never trusted with anything that might facilitate escape or resistance. From the endless labor of construction, you're about to experience punishment as entertainment, where justice became spectacle, and your death served as both legal sentence and public amusement. You're being pushed through a wooden gate into an arena filled with screaming crowds, and the smell hits you first. A mixture of blood, animal musk, and human fear that has soaked into the sand over years of similar performances. Welcome to the lion pits of Babylon, where criminal justice met crowd-pleasing entertainment in ways that would make Roman gladiator games look like children's theater. The arena itself was an architectural marvel designed specifically for maximum dramatic impact. The pit was deep enough to prevent escape, but shallow enough for spectators to see every detail of the carnage. Drainage systems channeled blood away from the fighting area to prevent the surface from becoming too slippery for proper combat, while hidden chambers allowed for the dramatic release of increasingly dangerous animals as the show progressed. It was theater design optimized for death. Your fellow condemned criminals come from every level of Babylonian society, creating a diverse cast for the day's entertainment. There's a former temple priest convicted of embezzlement, a merchant caught selling watered-down wine, and a soldier who deserted during battle. The crowd doesn't care about your individual crimes. They're here for the spectacle of watching civilized humans reduced to desperate animals fighting for their lives against actual animals who are much better at it. The lions themselves were carefully managed for maximum entertainment value. Arena managers understood that well-fed lions were lazy lions, so the big cats were kept hungry enough to be aggressive, but not so starved that they'd kill too quickly and end the show prematurely. It was wildlife management with a focus on prolonged human suffering rather than animal welfare. The perfect lion for arena work was hungry, angry, and slow enough to let the audience savor the chase. But here's where Babylonian creativity really shines. They developed a classification system for different types of animal execution based on the severity of the crime. Petty thieves faced a single, young lion, dangerous but potentially survivable if you were quick and lucky. Murderers confronted full-grown male lions in their prime. Traitors and those who offended the gods faced multiple lions, or worse, lions that had been deliberately provoked and injured to make them even more aggressive than usual. The crowd participation aspect turned execution into interactive entertainment that would make modern reality TV producers jealous. Spectators could bet on how long each criminal would survive, which body part would be attacked first, and whether anyone would manage to wound a lion before dying. Vendors sold programs listing each criminal's name, crime, and hometown, allowing the audience to pick favorites and follow individual storylines throughout the day's carnage. Historians still argue whether lion pit executions were common entertainment or reserved for special occasions, but surviving administrative records suggest that maintaining the necessary animals and facilities required substantial resources. The logistics of capturing, feeding, and managing large predators just for execution purposes indicates that these spectacles were probably less frequent than popular accounts suggest. making them more significant as special events rather than routine punishment. The preparation rituals added religious significance to what was essentially elaborate murder for entertainment. Priests blessed both the condemned criminals and the lions, invoking divine approval for the proceedings. The criminals were required to pray for forgiveness before entering the arena, not for their crimes, but for any suffering they might cause the sacred lions, by forcing the noble beasts to dirty their claws with criminal blood. It was victim blaming taken to theological extremes. The arena staff developed professional expertise in managing human-animal combat that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. They knew exactly how many wounds a person could sustain while remaining conscious and entertaining. They understood lion behavior well enough to predict attack patterns and prolong the spectacle. They could estimate survival times based on the criminal's age, health, and apparent courage level. It was scientific expertise applied to maximizing human suffering for public amusement. Different types of weapons were sometimes provided to criminals, not to give them a real chance of survival, but to make the show more interesting. A rusty knife might let someone wound a lion enough to enrage it further, creating more dramatic combat. A broken spear could provide false hope while ultimately proving useless against multiple attackers. The weapons were props in a deadly theater where the ending was predetermined, but the performance could still surprise. The cleanup procedures between shows reveal the industrial scale of these operations. Arena slaves raked fresh sand over the blood, removed body parts, and prepared the space for the next group of condemned criminals. The efficiency was remarkable. Multiple executions could be scheduled in a single day, with intermissions for food vendors and betting updates. It was death as assembly line entertainment, streamlined for maximum throughput and audience satisfaction. Seasonal scheduling made lion pit executions into major social events that drew visitors from across the empire. Summer spectacles took advantage of good weather and traveling season, when roads were passable and merchants could attend. Religious festivals provided convenient occasions for mass executions disguised as offerings to the gods. The timing turned judicial murder into tourist attractions that boosted the local economy while disposing of unwanted criminals. The psychological impact on survivors, both in the arena and in the audience, was carefully managed by religious authorities who insisted that watching criminal execution was actually a form of worship. Spectators were participating in divine justice, not enjoying human suffering. This religious framing helped normalize the violence and made regular attendance at executions a sign of piety rather than bloodthirstiness. It was moral justification for enjoying other people's agony. The lion pits treated all criminals equally once they entered the arena, but you're about to discover how Babylonian justice was anything but equal when it came to determining who faced which punishments. You're standing before a judge who's consulting not just the evidence of your crime, but a complex social hierarchy chart that will determine whether you lose a finger, a hand, or your life for exactly the same offense. Welcome to class-based justice, where your social status mattered more than your actual guilt or innocence. The three-tier system was brutally simple and consistently applied across all of Babylonian law. Free men occupied the top tier. Wealthy landowners, successful merchants, and government officials who enjoyed maximum legal protection and minimum punishment severity. The middle tier included artisans, small farmers, and skilled workers who had some legal rights but faced harsher penalties than their social superiors. At the bottom were slaves and foreigners, who were essentially legal nonentities, whose lives and bodies were completely disposable. Picture yourself as a middle-class potter who gets into a fight with a wealthy merchant. If you knock out his tooth, you'll have your own tooth knocked out in return. Fair enough, according to Hammurabi's famous eye for an eye principle. But if that same merchant knocks out your tooth, he simply pays a fine equivalent to a few days' wages. Your tooth is apparently worth less than his money, a mathematical equation that reduces human dignity to economic calculation based on social status. But here's where the system gets truly insidious. The punishments weren't just different in severity. They were designed to reinforce and perpetuate the social hierarchy that created them. A slave who struck a free man would have his hand cut off, permanently marking him as someone who had violated social boundaries. The missing hand became a permanent advertisement of his inferior status, ensuring that even if he somehow gained freedom, everyone would know he had once been presumptuous enough to strike his social superior. The sexual crimes reveal the system's deepest assumptions about whose bodies mattered and whose didn't. If a free man raped a slave woman, he paid a fine to her owner, not to her, but to the person who owned her damaged property. If a slave raped a free woman, he died horribly and publicly, his execution serving as entertainment and warning. The woman's social status determined whether rape was property damage or capital crime, reducing sexual violence to a question of the victim's market value. Historians still argue whether these class distinctions were rigidly enforced or served more as guidelines for judicial discretion. But surviving court records suggest that social status was the primary factor in sentencing decisions. Judges apparently spent more time determining a defendant's exact social position than examining evidence of their guilt or innocence. Justice wasn't blind in Babylon. It had excellent vision when it came to reading social hierarchies. The economic logic behind differential punishment was coldly practical. Society needed its productive free men to remain productive, so their punishments couldn't interfere too much with their ability to generate wealth and pay taxes. Slaves, however, were replaceable commodities whose bodies could be damaged or destroyed without significant economic loss to society as a whole. It was cost-benefit analysis applied to human suffering, with social utility determining punishment severity. Property crimes demonstrated the system's priorities with mathematical precision. Steal from a palace or temple, and you died regardless of social status. Some institutions were too important to allow any theft. But steal from a private citizen, and your punishment depended entirely on your victim's social rank compared to your own. Rob a slave, and you might just pay replacement value. Rob a noble, and you'd lose body parts in proportion to the social distance between you and your victim. The testimony rules reveal how thoroughly social status permeated every aspect of legal proceedings. A free man's word was worth more than a commoner's, which was worth more than a slave's. In disputes between different social classes, the higher status person's testimony was automatically given more weight, regardless of other evidence. It was like a legal system with built-in bias amplifiers, ensuring that social prejudices became judicial conclusions. Professional penalties followed the same hierarchical logic, with devastating consequences for social mobility. A free surgeon who botched an operation on another free man lost his hands, ending his career but preserving his life. A slave practicing medicine without permission was executed immediately, even if his treatment was successful. The system punished ambition that crossed class boundaries more severely than actual incompetence within appropriate social roles. The appeals process, or lack thereof, reinforced these distinctions at every level. Free men could sometimes petition for reduced sentences or alternative punishments, especially if they had political connections or family wealth. Commoners might occasionally receive mercy if they could demonstrate exceptional circumstances. Slaves had no appeals process at all. Their sentences were final, immediate, and non-negotiable, because society had already determined that their lives had minimal value worth preserving. Marriage laws created a complex web of punishments that varied based on the social status of everyone involved. Adultery between free persons might result in drowning, but adultery involving slaves created different penalties depending on who owned whom and what their masters preferred. The same physical act could be a capital crime, a property dispute, or a minor infraction, depending entirely on the social positions of the participants rather than the nature of their behavior. The psychological impact of class-based justice was profound and intentional. Everyone in Babylonian society understood that their legal protection depended on maintaining their social position, creating powerful incentives to conform to hierarchy rather than challenge it. The law didn't just punish crimes, it punished social presumption, ensuring that legal consequences reinforced cultural boundaries and discouraged attempts at from the courthouse hierarchies. You're about to experience punishment that strips away all pretense of civilization and reduces justice to its most primitive form: abandonment. You're being dragged beyond Babylon's walls, past the last irrigation ditches and cultivated fields, toward the endless expanse of desert that stretches to the horizon like a brown ocean of death. This isn't execution, it's something worse. You're being sentenced to exile in the wasteland, where the desert itself becomes your executioner and death comes slowly, painfully, and inevitably. Desert exile was punishment disguised as mercy, a way for Babylonian courts to order death sentences without technically becoming executioners. The legal fiction was elegant. You weren't being killed, just relocated to an environment where survival was theoretically possible but practically impossible. It let judges maintain the illusion of humanitarian justice while condemning criminals to deaths that were often more brutal than any public execution. The desert didn't discriminate based on social class. It killed nobles and slaves with equal efficiency. The preparation for exile followed bureaucratic procedures that would be comical if they weren't so cruel. You're issued a single day's ration of water and bread, officially enough to reach the nearest oasis if you knew where it was and could travel faster than humanly possible. The guards solemnly record this provision in their official logs, creating a paper trail that proves the state provided for your survival needs. It's like giving someone a parachute with holes in it and claiming you equipped them for a safe landing. The geographical knowledge required for desert survival was carefully withheld from exiled criminals. Maps were state secrets, water source locations were privileged information, and even basic navigation techniques were forbidden knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. You're being sent into a landscape you don't understand, without the tools or knowledge necessary for survival, making your exile less like banishment and more like elaborate murder disguised as geographical relocation. But here's where Babylonian cruelty meets administrative efficiency. They developed optimal exile distances based on the severity of different crimes. Petty thieves were dumped at the edge of cultivated land, giving them a slim chance of finding their way back or reaching friendly settlements. Murderers were taken deeper into the wasteland, far enough to ensure that even if they somehow survived, they couldn't return to threaten civilization. Political rebels were taken to the deepest desert, where their bones would bleach in the sun as permanent warnings against challenging royal authority. The physical challenges of desert survival were compounded by psychological torture that began before you even left the city. Exile was announced publicly, allowing friends and family to say their goodbyes while understanding that they were witnessing a slow-motion execution. The condemned person had to walk through familiar streets knowing they'd never see them again, past shops and homes and people who would soon forget they ever existed. It was a funeral procession for someone who wasn't dead yet. Historians still argue whether desert exile was primarily punishment or population control, but the practical effect was the same. Unwanted people disappeared without creating martyrs or requiring public executions that might generate sympathy. The desert did the state's dirty work while maintaining the government's clean image as a civilized legal system that didn't actually execute people, just relocated them to places where execution was inevitable. The few survival accounts that exist describe a nightmare of disorientation, dehydration, and gradual madness as the brain slowly cooked in the Mesopotamian heat. Exiled criminals would wander in circles, chasing mirages that promised water but delivered only more sand. The desert created its own hallucinations, false hopes that prolonged suffering by preventing the acceptance of death that might have brought some peace to the dying process. Scavenger management was a gruesome but necessary aspect of desert exile administration. The authorities knew that bodies left in the wasteland would attract dangerous predators that might eventually threaten settled areas. Special patrols were assigned to monitor the likely death zones and remove remains before they created ecological problems. It was waste management applied to human corpses, ensuring that even in death, exiled criminals served the state's administrative needs. The seasonal timing of exile sentences reflected careful calculation of suffering duration and resource management. Summer exiles died quickly from heat stroke and dehydration, providing swift justice but limited deterrent effect. Winter exiles might survive longer, creating more visible suffering that served as better warnings to potential criminals. Spring and fall exiles faced the worst of both extremes, with temperature fluctuations that prolonged agony while maintaining hope just long enough to maximize psychological torture. Water mirage psychology became a specialized form of cruelty that the authorities understood and exploited. The human brain's desperate need to find water in desert conditions creates powerful hallucinations that can drive people to walk even further from safety while chasing phantom oases. Exile locations were chosen specifically to maximize these disorienting effects, ensuring that condemned criminals would walk deeper into the wasteland rather than accidentally stumbling back toward civilization. The rare survivors who somehow made it to distant settlements created their own problems for Babylonian administration. These living ghosts carried stories of their ordeal that could either serve as powerful deterrents or create sympathy for future exiles. The authorities had to balance the propaganda value of survivor testimonies against the risk that too many survival stories might make exile seem less than the death sentence it was intended to be. Exile documentation was meticulously maintained for administrative and legal purposes that reveal the bureaucratic mindset behind this form of execution. Records included the criminal's name, crime, exile distance. The desert exile was cruel enough, but you're about to discover punishment that combined murder with architecture in ways that would make modern serial killers seem like amateurs. You're standing in a foundation pit that will soon become the basement of a new palace, and you're not here as a construction worker. You're here as building material. Welcome to Live Burial in Building Foundations, where human sacrifice met urban planning, and your death became literally foundational to Babylonian architecture. This wasn't random violence disguised as construction. It was systematic human sacrifice, based on the belief that buildings needed living souls to provide spiritual strength and protection. The architectural theory was that structures built on top of buried humans would be blessed by the gods and protected from collapse, siege, or natural disaster. Your death would serve the dual purpose of punishment for your crimes and spiritual insurance for whatever building rose above your grave. The selection process for foundation burial followed specific criteria that mixed criminal justice with religious requirements. Not just any criminal could serve as building foundation. The sacrifice had to match the structure's importance and intended use. Palace foundations required high-status criminals like corrupt officials or military deserters. Temple foundations demanded criminals whose offenses were specifically religious, like those convicted of blasphemy or temple theft. Even in death, social hierarchy and crime category determined your final resting place. The positioning within the foundation wasn't random either. Central locations under load-bearing walls required the most spiritually powerful sacrifices, usually reserved for the worst criminals or most important buildings. Corner positions were for lesser offenses, while perimeter burials served more as general protection than structural blessing. It was like architectural planning with a human resources department that specialized in corpse placement rather than personnel management. But here's where Babylonian engineering meets ritual murder. They developed techniques to keep the buried victims alive for as long as possible during the construction process. Quick death would waste the spiritual energy that was supposed to bless the building. Instead, victims were positioned in specially designed chambers that provided just enough air and space to prolong consciousness, while the foundation was built around them. Your awareness of being slowly entombed was considered essential to the ritual's effectiveness. The construction timeline was coordinated with the dying process to maximize both spiritual benefit and practical efficiency. Foundation laying began with the burial ceremony, followed by gradual covering that allowed workers to monitor the victim's condition and adjust their pace accordingly. The goal was to complete the foundation work while the sacrifice was still alive but dying, capturing the moment of death within the building's spiritual framework. Historians still argue whether live foundation burial was widespread practice or limited to the most important construction projects. But archaeological evidence from various Mesopotamian sites suggests that human remains in building foundations were more common than previously thought. Whether this represents systematic ritual murder or coincidental burial practices remains debated, but the legal records clearly show that it was at least sometimes used as criminal punishment. The religious authorities who supervised foundation burials had developed elaborate theological justifications for what was essentially torture disguised as construction. The victims' suffering was reframed as spiritual service, their death as divine offering, and their burial as consecration rather than murder. It was theological gaslighting on an architectural scale, using religious language to justify practices that would horrify even the most hardened criminals. The family notification procedures reveal the bureaucratic mindset behind ritualized murder. Relatives were informed that their condemned family member would be serving the gods through architectural blessing, a euphemism that obscured the reality of live burial while maintaining the legal fiction that this was religious service rather than execution. Families could attend the ceremony, but were forbidden from interfering with the ritual requirements. Different building types required different burial configurations, creating a specialized knowledge base among construction supervisors and religious officials. Residential foundations needed fewer human sacrifices than public buildings, while military fortifications required warriors to be buried at strategic points to provide spiritual defense against enemies. Temples demanded the most elaborate sacrifice arrangements, with multiple victims positioned according to complex theological requirements. The psychological torture began long before the actual burial, as condemned criminals were forced to inspect their intended burial sites and understand exactly how they would die. This preview served both practical and cruel purposes. Victims could identify any construction flaws that might interfere with the ritual, while the anticipation of slow suffocation added extra psychological punishment to the physical death sentence. The timing coordination between legal sentence and construction schedule created logistical challenges that required careful planning. Foundation burials couldn't be delayed without affecting building timelines, but criminal trials couldn't be rushed just to meet construction deadlines. Special legal procedures were developed to ensure that the right criminals were available at the right times for the right building projects, creating a scheduling system that coordinated judicial murder with urban development. Quality control procedures ensured that foundation burials met both religious and engineering requirements. Inspectors verified that victims were properly positioned, adequately conscious, and spiritually prepared for their role as architectural blessing. Poor burial technique could compromise both the building's structural integrity and its divine protection, making competent execution essential for both practical and theological reasons. The documentation requirements for foundation burials were extensive and detailed, reflecting the importance of maintaining accurate records for both legal and religious purposes. Each sacrifice was recorded with the victim's name, crime, burial position, and expected spiritual contribution to the building's protection. These records served as insurance policies for the buildings themselves, proving that proper spiritual precautions had been taken during construction and providing legal evidence that sacrifice requirements had been met. The leather workshops of Babylon held a terrible secret that you'd never expect from such ordinary-seeming places. You walk past rows of craftsmen working animal hides, the familiar smell of tanning solutions filling your nostrils, when suddenly you notice something that makes your blood freeze. Mixed among the cow and goat skins hanging to dry are patches of leather with a distinctly different texture, smoother, more delicate, with hair follicles that look disturbingly familiar. You're witnessing one of Babylon's most psychologically devastating punishments, the systematic flaying of criminals whose preserved skin would then be displayed as a warning to others. The process began with the condemned being stripped and tied spread-eagle to wooden frames in the city's execution grounds. Professional flayers, men who had learned their craft through years of working with animal hides, would approach with their sharpened knives and begin the meticulous process of separating skin from muscle. The technique required remarkable skill, almost artistic precision. You watch as the executioner makes his first incision, a shallow cut that barely penetrates the dermis. The goal wasn't speed but completeness. They wanted the skin to come away in the largest possible pieces, intact and unmarked except for the necessary cuts. Starting from the extremities, the flayer would work his blade between skin and flesh, using short, controlled strokes while pulling the hide taut with his free hand. Historians still argue whether the victims were kept alive throughout the entire process or mercifully killed beforehand, though most evidence suggests the former. The psychological impact depended largely on the criminal remaining conscious to witness their own transformation from human to raw meat. You can imagine the horrific awareness as feeling gradually disappeared from your limbs, replaced by the burning sensation of exposed nerve endings meeting air. The flaying could take hours, depending on the executioner's skill and the specific requirements of the punishment. For minor crimes, they might only remove the skin from hands and face, enough to create a recognizable warning while allowing the victim to potentially survive. For serious offenses like treason or temple desecration, they removed every inch of skin from the entire body, creating what the Babylonians called the Red Man, a walking anatomy lesson that rarely survived more than a few agonizing hours. What made this punishment particularly insidious was its aftermath. You discover that the removed skin wasn't simply discarded, but carefully preserved using the same techniques applied to animal hides. The human leather was then fashioned into various items: wall hangings for the palace, book covers for legal documents, or even clothing items for the executioner himself. Some pieces were stretched on frames and hung from the city gates with bronze plaques identifying the original owner and their crime. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be overstated. You realize that every citizen of Babylon would eventually encounter these human leather displays in their daily lives. A merchant might handle contracts bound in the skin of a tax evader. A student might read from scrolls wrapped in the hide of a temple thief. The constant, subtle reminder that human skin could be transformed into mundane objects created an atmosphere of perpetual unease. The process also served a practical legal function in Babylonian society. Unlike other forms of execution that simply removed the criminal from existence, flaying created permanent evidence of justice served. You can see how judges would point to specific pieces of human leather when sentencing new criminals, saying, "This was Naburimani, who stole from the temple of Marduk. Do you see how well preserved his skin remains? Yours will join it if you continue down this path." Modern forensic experts have studied preserved examples of this practice and determined that the Babylonian flayers possessed remarkable anatomical knowledge. They understood precisely how to separate the different layers of human skin, how to avoid damaging the underlying muscle structure, and how to preserve the removed hide so it wouldn't decompose. It's honestly impressive in the most disturbing way possible. Like discovering your friendly neighborhood butcher is also a serial killer with an art degree. The practice reached its peak during periods of civil unrest, when large numbers of rebels needed to be processed efficiently. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Babylonian execution grounds contained specialized flaying stations with drainage systems. The foundries of Babylon weren't just centers of artistic creation. They doubled as execution chambers, where thieves met their end through one of the most agonizing methods ever devised. You stand in the scorching heat of the metalworker's quarter, watching as bronze and copper bubble in clay crucibles, when you realize that some of those glowing vessels aren't destined for sculpture or jewelry. They're preparing the final meal for someone who dared steal from the wrong person. Molten metal execution represented the Babylonian concept of poetic justice taken to its most literal extreme. You see how the punishment fit the crime with terrifying precision. Those who stole gold faced death by molten gold, silver thieves received silver, and common criminals got bronze or lead. The temperature of these metals when liquid ranged from 1,000 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to instantly destroy any living tissue it contacted. The condemned thief would be brought to the foundry and secured to a tilting wooden chair, similar to those used by ancient dentists, but with leather restraints at the wrists, ankles, and forehead. You watch as they position a bronze funnel between the victim's teeth, holding their mouth open while assistants heat the metal to proper consistency. The entire process required precise timing. Too hot, and the metal would vaporize instantly. Too cool, and it wouldn't flow properly down the throat. What you're witnessing represents sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, applied to human destruction. The executioners understood that different metals produced different effects. Lead caused gradual poisoning before burning. Copper created vivid green flames as it interacted with saliva, while gold, reserved for the most serious theft cases, produced an almost supernatural glow as it flowed. They also knew that adding certain compounds could modify the metal's behavior, making it cling to tissue or burn more slowly. The actual execution began with a small test pour, just a few drops to ensure proper temperature and consistency. You can imagine the victim's terror as they feel the first scalding drops hit their tongue, knowing what's coming next. The full pour happened quickly, the executioner tilting the crucible in one smooth motion that sent molten metal cascading down the funnel and into the condemned person's throat. Death came within seconds, but not from the obvious cause you might expect. Historians still argue whether victims died from tissue destruction, metal poisoning, or simple shock, though most evidence points to immediate cardiac arrest caused by the body's inability to process such extreme trauma. The molten metal would solidify almost instantly upon contact with cooler internal tissues, creating a bronze or copper cast of the victim's throat and upper digestive system. These internal metal casts served a secondary purpose in Babylonian justice. After the body was cremated, workers would carefully extract the solidified metal sculpture from the ashes. These grotesque bronzes were then displayed in the marketplace as warnings, labeled with details about the original crime. You might walk through Babylon's commercial district and see dozens of these throat-shaped metal lumps hanging from vendor stalls, each one representing a thief who thought they could outsmart the system. The practice required remarkable technical expertise that demonstrates just how advanced Babylonian metallurgy had become. They developed special alloys that would remain liquid longer, created precision-engineered funnels that controlled flow rate, and even invented temperature-measuring techniques using color changes in the metal itself. It's like discovering that your local blacksmith moonlights as a NASA engineer, except instead of sending rockets to space, he's sending molten copper down people's throats. Records suggest that wealthy victims could sometimes negotiate alternative metals for their execution. A merchant caught embezzling gold might pay extra to die by silver instead, believing it offered a more honorable death. Some criminal families would pool resources to upgrade their relatives' execution metal, treating it almost like purchasing a better funeral package. The psychological complexity of this arrangement reveals just how thoroughly the punishment had become integrated into Babylonian social hierarchy. The foundry executions also served as public entertainment, drawing crowds of spectators who would gather to watch the metalworking process from start to finish. You can picture families bringing children to witness justice being served, vendors selling snacks outside the foundry, and betting pools forming around which metal would be used for each execution. It transformed what should have been a solemn legal proceeding into something resembling a county fair, with a horrifying main attraction. Archaeological excavations have uncovered execution foundries with specialized equipment designed specifically for this purpose. Crucibles with pouring spouts, adjustable restraint chairs, and even early ventilation systems to remove toxic fumes from the workspace. The level of infrastructure investment suggests this wasn't an occasion. Deep beneath the sun-baked streets of Babylon lay a network of salt mines that served as the empire's most dreaded form of life sentence. You descend through narrow stone passages, the air growing thick and acrid as crystalline walls begin to glisten in the torchlight. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a tomb where criminals were sent to hack away their remaining years in conditions that would make modern prisoners beg for solitary confinement. The salt mines represented Babylon's solution to criminals whose crimes were too serious for fines, but not quite serious enough for immediate execution. You discover that judges would sentence thieves, debtors, and political dissidents to work until the salt claims you. A euphemism everyone understood meant slow death through exhaustion, lung disease, and gradual mineral poisoning. The average survival time was 18 months, though some exceptional individuals lasted nearly 3 years before their bodies finally surrendered. Your first impression of the working conditions is the crushing darkness broken only by occasional oil lamps. The miners worked in teams of 4, chained together at the ankles to prevent escape attempts, swinging heavy picks at salt formations that had been accumulating for thousands of years. The constant impact sent clouds of crystalline dust into the air, coating everything in a fine white powder that burned your eyes and throat with each breath. The physical demands were intentionally brutal. You watch as miners swing their tools for 12-hour shifts, removing salt chunks that supervisors would weigh and record. Each team had daily quotas that increased weekly, a system designed to ensure that even the strongest workers would eventually break down. Those who failed to meet their targets received reduced food rations, creating a downward spiral where weakening bodies faced ever-increasing demands. What made the salt mines particularly insidious was the environment's effect on human physiology. The high mineral content in the air caused severe respiratory problems within weeks of arrival. You can see how the salt crystals would embed themselves in lung tissue, creating painful breathing difficulties that grew progressively worse. Long-term miners developed a distinctive wheezing cough that marked them as clearly as any brand or tattoo. The salt also wreaked havoc on the skin and digestive system. Constant exposure caused severe dermatitis, with miners' hands and arms developing open sores that never properly healed in the mineral-rich environment. Drinking water in the mines contained high salt concentrations that led to kidney problems and digestive issues. You realize that even if someone could somehow escape, their body would be so damaged by salt exposure that survival on the surface would be unlikely. Historians still argue whether the Babylonians fully understood the medical implications of prolonged salt exposure, or if they simply observed that the mines killed people efficiently. Evidence suggests they had at least basic knowledge of the health effects, as mine supervisors used protective cloth masks and rotated their assignments to avoid prolonged exposure. The criminals, naturally, received no such protection. The psychological aspects of salt mine punishment were carefully calculated to maximize suffering. Unlike quick executions that ended suffering rapidly, the mines offered false hope. You might survive another day, another week, another month. This uncertainty prevented the mental surrender that might have provided some peace, keeping victims in a constant state of desperate calculation about their chances for survival. The mine layout itself was designed to prevent escape attempts. You navigate through a maze of tunnels that connected in seemingly random patterns, deliberately confusing to anyone unfamiliar with the route to the surface. Guards were stationed at key intersections, and the ankle chains made it impossible to move quickly or quietly. Even if someone managed to break free, the salt-damaged lungs and weakened muscles made running virtually impossible. Records indicate that some criminal families would attempt to bribe officials for shorter sentences or better working conditions within the mines. Occasionally, these bribes were accepted, leading to a two-tier system where wealthy criminals might receive assignments in less dangerous areas or access to slightly better food and water. However, even these privileged positions still resulted in death, just somewhat slower and less agonizing than the standard experience. The salt extracted by criminal labor formed an important part of Babylon's economy. You discover that much of the empire's preserved food, leather processing, and textile dyeing depended on salt harvested by dying prisoners. This economic integration meant that the punishment served multiple purposes: removing criminals from society, generating valuable resources, and providing a visible deterrent to potential lawbreakers. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated engineering in the mine construction, including drainage systems to prevent flooding, ventilation shafts to provide minimal air circulation, and even primitive elevators for moving salt to the surface. The level of infrastructure investment demonstrates that this wasn't a hastily improvised punishment, but a carefully planned component of Babylonian criminal justice. Some mines contained workshops where skilled criminals could extend their lives by teaching their trades to younger prisoners. You might find a master metalworker training apprentices in basic techniques, or a scribe teaching literacy to fellow inmates. These knowledge transfer arrangements provided slight improvements in living conditions for teachers, while ensuring that valuable skills weren't completely lost when criminals died. The city walls of Babylon stretched for miles, their massive brick surfaces broken by hundreds of wooden crosses, bearing the slowly dying bodies of rebels and enemies of the state. You walk along the perimeter road, trying not to look up at the forest of crucifixion posts, but the moaning and occasional cry for water makes it impossible to ignore the human suffering displayed above your head like a grotesque art installation. Mass crucifixion represented Babylon's most public and psychologically devastating form of punishment, reserved for those who challenged the empire's authority through rebellion, treason, or large-scale civil disobedience. Unlike individual executions that might draw a few dozen spectators, these massive displays could feature hundreds of crosses arranged along the city's most traveled routes, ensuring that every citizen and visitor would witness the consequences of defying Babylonian power. The crucifixion process began with specially trained carpentry teams who constructed the crosses using standardized measurements and techniques. You observe how they selected wood types based on durability and weight, typically cedar or oak that could support a human body for days without breaking. The crosses weren't the traditional Christian symbol you might expect, but T-shaped structures called tau crosses, which required less material while providing adequate support for prolonged suffering. What made Babylonian crucifixion particularly brutal was the systematic nature of the operation. You watch as execution teams work with industrial efficiency, processing rebels through standardized steps: stripping, flogging, nail placement, and positioning. Each cross was numbered and assigned to specific executioners who took professional pride in their ability to keep victims alive for maximum duration. The goal wasn't quick death, but prolonged public suffering that would terrorize potential rebels. The nail placement required surgical precision that Babylonian executioners had perfected through years of practice. You see how they avoided major arteries and bones, instead driving iron spikes through the spaces between arm bones just above the wrists, and through the feet between the small bones that wouldn't provide enough support if damaged. This technique prevented immediate death from blood loss, while ensuring the victim couldn't pull free from the restraints. Historians still argue whether victims were given any form of pain relief, or if the prolonged agony was entirely intentional, though most evidence suggests the latter. The Babylonians understood that crucifixion's power as a deterrent depended on visible suffering that could be heard and observed by passers-by. Sedating the victims would have defeated the punishment's primary purpose as psychological warfare against potential rebels. The positioning along city walls wasn't random, but carefully planned to maximize public impact. You notice how the crosses are arranged so that people approaching Babylon from any direction would encounter them first, creating an immediate impression of the empire's power and ruthlessness. The most prominent positions, near main gates and major roads, were reserved for rebellion leaders whose slow deaths would be witnessed by the maximum number of people. The dying process typically took between 2 and 4 days, depending on the victim's health and the executioner's skill. You observe how death came not from the obvious trauma of crucifixion, but from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and respiratory failure. The position of the body on the cross made normal breathing extremely difficult, forcing victims to push up with their legs to expand their lungs, a process that became increasingly impossible as strength faded. What made this punishment psychologically devastating for observers was its deliberate visibility. Unlike executions that happened quickly in designated areas, crucifixion forced ordinary citizens to witness prolonged human suffering during their daily activities. You might be walking to market and hear someone crying for their mother, or conducting business near the walls while listening to rebels slowly suffocate just overhead. The crosses themselves became part of Babylon's urban landscape, with some remaining in place long after the victims died. Skeletal remains would hang from the wooden frames for weeks or months, serving as permanent reminders of what happened to those who challenged imperial authority. Children grew up seeing these displays as normal parts of city life, creating generations of citizens who internalized the consequences of rebellion from an early age. Records suggest that some crucifixion victims were kept alive longer through minimal care, small amounts of water delivered on sponges, or positioning adjustments that eased breathing slightly. This wasn't mercy but calculated cruelty designed to extend the suffering and increase the deterrent effect. You realize that executioners had become experts in the precise balance between keeping someone alive and allowing them to die naturally. The mass crucifixions also served as entertainment for certain segments of Babylonian society. You discover that vendors would set up food stalls near popular crucifixion sites. Betting pools formed around how long specific victims would survive, and some wealthy citizens would host viewing parties on rooftops overlooking the execution areas. The normalization of this suffering reveals just how thoroughly violence had been integrated into daily life. Archaeological evidence shows that crucifixion sites were equipped with permanent infrastructure, stone foundations for crosses, water sources for executioners, and even primitive amphitheater seating for officials who needed to witness the punishment being carried out according to legal requirements. The investment in permanent facilities demonstrates that mass crucifixion wasn't an emergency measure, but a planned component of imperial control. Beyond the physical torments that marked Babylonian justice lay a realm of supernatural punishment that you can barely comprehend. Divine curses and otherworldly tortures that extended far beyond the grave. You stand in the temple of Marduk as priests prepare ritual implements for the most feared punishment in their arsenal, calling down the wrath of gods to inflict suffering that would follow criminals through death and into whatever existence awaited beyond. The concept of divine punishment represented the ultimate escalation in Babylonian criminal justice, reserved for crimes that weren't just illegal but sacrilegious. Temple theft, blasphemy, desecration of sacred spaces, or betraying oaths sworn before the gods. You watch as priests dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes, begin the complex rituals required to petition deities for supernatural intervention in mortal justice. The process began with detailed divination to determine which specific god had been offended and what form of supernatural punishment would be most appropriate. You observe priests examining sheep livers, interpreting oil patterns on water, and consulting ancient tablets that catalog divine preferences for different types of retribution. This wasn't random curse hurling, but methodical supernatural jurisprudence with established procedures and precedents. What made divine punishment so terrifying was its scope and permanence. Unlike physical torture that ended with death, supernatural curses were believed to follow the victim's soul through whatever afterlife awaited, creating eternal suffering that made even the most brutal earthly punishment seem temporary by comparison. You realize that Babylonians lived in genuine fear of spiritual consequences that could transcend death itself. The actual curse ceremonies involved elaborate rituals designed to focus divine attention on the specific criminal and their offense. You witness priests burning specially prepared incense, reciting lengthy invocations in sacred languages, and manipulating ritual objects that represented different aspects of the punishment being requested. Some ceremonies lasted for days, with multiple priests working in shifts to maintain the necessary spiritual intensity. Historians still argue whether the priests genuinely believed in the effectiveness of these supernatural punishments, or if they represented sophisticated psychological warfare designed to terrify potential criminals through the power of suggestion. Evidence suggests a combination of both. Many priests showed signs of genuine religious conviction, while also understanding the deterrent value of divine punishment rumors. The types of supernatural torture supposedly inflicted ranged from relatively subtle harassment to cosmic-level suffering. You learn about curses that would cause the victim's food to turn to ash in their mouth, water to become undrinkable sand, and sleep to be filled with terrifying visions of their future torment. More severe divine punishments included having the victim's name erased from all records, their family line cursed for 7 generations, and their soul condemned to wander eternally without rest or peace. Some divine curses were designed to manifest physical symptoms that would mark the victim as God-touched and avoided by ordinary citizens. You discover accounts of criminals developing mysterious skin conditions, speaking in unknown languages, or experiencing seizures that priests interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Whether these symptoms were genuine supernatural phenomena, psychosomatic responses to extreme stress, or deliberate poisoning by temple officials remains a subject of scholarly debate. The social impact of divine punishment extended far beyond the individual criminal. You observe how families of the cursed often faced discrimination and social isolation, as other citizens feared that association with the divinely punished might draw supernatural attention to themselves. This created additional layers of suffering that affected innocent relatives and served as a powerful deterrent to potential criminals who might otherwise risk personal consequences. The priests responsible for divine punishment held extraordinary power within Babylonian society, as they were believed capable of literally summoning divine wrath against anyone who crossed them. You see how this authority created opportunities for both genuine justice and terrible abuse, as corrupt priests might threaten supernatural punishment to extort bribes or eliminate personal enemies. The line between legitimate religious authority and spiritual terrorism was often razor-thin. Archaeological evidence reveals that temples contained specialized chambers designed specifically for curse rituals, complete with drainage systems for blood offerings, ventilation for incense burning, and acoustic design that amplified the priests' voices during lengthy invocations. The architectural investment demonstrates that divine punishment wasn't a minor aspect of temple function, but a central feature of religious and legal authority. Records suggest that some victims of divine curses attempted to negotiate with the gods through counter-rituals, additional offerings, or appeals to different deities who might intervene on their behalf. These spiritual legal battles could continue for years, with both sides escalating their supernatural efforts until the outcome was determined by signs, omens, or the victim's eventual death. It was like cosmic litigation where the stakes were eternal salvation or damnation. The most chilling aspect of divine punishment was its unpredictability and potential for escalation. You realize that unlike physical torture, which had clear limits based on human endurance, supernatural suffering was theoretically infinite and could be modified by the gods according to their whims. A curse that began as mild inconvenience might evolve into life-destroying torment if the victim failed to show proper repentance, or if the gods decided to make an example of them. The integration of divine punishment into Babylonian criminal justice created a system where spiritual authority and secular power reinforced each other in maintaining social control. Citizens faced not only earthly consequences for their crimes, but potential eternal suffering that made even death seem preferable to divine displeasure. This psychological framework helped maintain order through fear that transcended physical existence and entered the realm of cosmic horror. As you witness these final, most terrible punishments of ancient Babylon, you begin to understand how a civilization could maintain control over millions of people across vast territories. The combination of creative physical torture, economic devastation, social humiliation, and supernatural terror created layers of deterrence that made rebellion seem not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. Yet somehow, people still found ways to resist, to maintain their humanity, and to hope for better days even in the face of such overwhelming systematic cruelty. The shadows grow longer now, and the ancient city of Babylon fades back into the desert sands where it has slept for millennia. You've walked through its streets, witnessed its justice, and seen how human creativity can be turned toward the darkest purposes imaginable. These weren't just punishments. They were statements about power, control, and the lengths to which people will go to maintain order in their vision of civilization. Perhaps what's most unsettling isn't the creativity of the tortures themselves, but how ordinary they became to the people who lived with them daily. Citizens walked past crucified rebels on their way to market. Children played in streets where human leather hung from buildings, and families gathered for meals while knowing that somewhere nearby, criminals were being slowly consumed by molten metal or salt-poisoned air. The normalization of such extreme suffering reveals something profound about human adaptability, both our capacity to endure horror and our ability to become complicit in it. Yet even in this catalog of cruelty, threads of humanity persist. People still loved their families, still found moments of joy, still maintained hope for better tomorrows. They told stories, created art, built lasting monuments, and passed down wisdom that survived long after their empire crumbled. The same civilization that devised these terrible punishments also gave us mathematics, astronomy, literature, and legal concepts that still influence our world today. As you drift toward sleep, let these ancient voices fade into whispers, then silence. The past cannot harm you now. It exists only in memory and imagination, in the stories we tell to understand how we became who we are. Rest easy knowing that while humans are capable of terrible cruelty, we're also capable of tremendous compassion, creativity, and growth. Sweet dreams, and remember that dawn